Stop messing around, stop fooling around, stop delaying, stop procrastinating. Get up, get out, get it done. Everything is possible, nothing is a problem, and anything can be overcome. I just get my ass up out of bed, I get my shit together, and I get out and I start the fight. And that will transform you from a mere mortal into a superhuman being. I've never, ever, ever met anybody who told me that they got rich watching their IRA or their 401k. All the A students that went to the Ivy League schools who were smarter than you at your school growing up and in college and everywhere, all the A students go on to be bankers at banks. Leaves the entrepreneur to go out there and make the money and solve the world's problems.
Wasn't there the old saying that the A students work for the B students that make money?
The A students work for the C students.
Yeah, right, yeah.
That is an old saying. I believe it. Yeah. If you look at all these major guys, forget about like the regular successful guys, but if you look at like the majorly successful people, they're all high school and college dropouts. They couldn't map to the box that was the normal thing that those schools were trying to deliver. Their minds far exceeded that stuff. So they said, screw it. Yeah. And they took their story to the streets. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And they won. I mean, the most successful people I know, financially successful people that I know, were high school and/or college dropouts. Yeah. I know a guy that didn't even finish high school. He's massive. He's so smart. This guy just fell way outside of the lines. And so he just said, see ya, I got to go do my own thing.
So I've been hearing about forbearance. What is forbearance? What do I need to know about it? Is it good? Is it bad? Fill me in.
It's a popular word in the media these days.
Yeah.
Because it's being used way more than it ever did before. So in normal times, in good markets, you never hear about forbearance. And now, in the pandemic, soon to be post-pandemic, hopefully, world, you've got all these people and businesses and borrowers that couldn't make the debt payments that they contracted and obligated themselves to make pre-pandemic. So forbearance is when you call up your bank and say, I can't do this, it's not working for me, we have to modify or change the original loan document, we got to work it out. So in good times in an up market, the banker's going to say, sorry man, no way. I'm not going into forbearance with you. The bankers don't want to do it because it's a reflection on them. When they get reviewed, their annual review for compensation and performance by their banks where they work, they review these loan originators and they see if anybody's in forbearance. If someone's in forbearance, they get fired, penalized, deducted, slap on the wrist, slap in the face, whatever happens. But you don't want to have a loan that you've originated go into forbearance if you're a banker in the banking business. So in good times, we never really saw that happen so much. But when crisis occurs, and when you have 2008, and when you have pandemic in 2020, you hear the term forbearance a lot more. So what we're seeing now is that the government's distributed their aid, they continue to, and it gets to where it needs to go, but people are still having a tough time making their mortgage payments, their debt payments, meeting those obligations that they contracted for. Even after the aid, even after the stimulus, even after the government says, all right, if you're in a government-backed loan product, no evictions, right? You've got eviction moratoriums, the courts are closed anyway. Even after all that stuff, there's forbearance happening. So forbearance is going on because these borrowers are saying to the banks, look, there's no way I'm making these payments. We have to adjust and modify the original loan contract. Yeah. The banks are now saying, okay, but they're taking it slow. They're putting their little toe in the water and they're saying, we're going to modify the terms, 3 months, let's talk about it in 90 days. So that's what's been happening, but the 90 days are coming up and the borrowers are going back saying, look, I need another 90. The banks are doing it. For the most part, the banks are doing it. A position they never were in before the pandemic. And when times were good and when the money was flowing and when borrowers were able to make their payments, because the banks are saying, look, I'm collateralized. I have your personal guarantee. I'm backed by the collateral. I've got the asset pledged. I've got your inventory. I've got all sorts of income and accounts and stuff. I've got a global securitization of this loan here. I'm not going into forbearance. It fucks me, fucks my bank. You got to step up and you got to perform here. Not anymore. The banks are saying, all right, we don't know what asset values are. We're not going to, if we foreclose, we can't because the courts are closed anyway. And even if we were able to foreclose after a billion years and going through the process, we're ending up with an asset. We don't want to own it. Who knows what it's going to be worth? All of the securitization that we did when we underwrote this thing in the first place, it's out the window because we don't know where asset values are. We don't know what the income is. We can't globally underwrite this. They're going to do a forbearance agreement with you. It's all coming to a head because it's been 90 days already on the first round. It's been 90 days extension on the second round. We're getting into rounds 3, maybe 4 for forbearance right now. We're going to see what happens this year. Is it good? Look, the banks don't have a choice at this point. Rarely do we see them backed into a corner like this, but they don't have a whole lot of options. Borrowers don't have a whole lot of options. The banks, unless they want to go through a court process that they're going to lose and own an asset that they don't want to own, they're going to have to work it out with their borrower. So they're going to do forbearance agreements. It's going to be good for the borrower and for the banks right now. Generally speaking, forbearance isn't great, but what else can you do right now? Not much. If you're a borrower, avoid forbearance unless you really need to. If you really need to, have to sit down with your banker and try and figure it out. But otherwise, forbearance agreements, tough, but they're happening.
Yeah.
They're happening.
I want to segue into talking about efficiencies. We've talked about this
I
a little
love
bit
that.
before. You've talked about systems and all
Yeah.
that kind of thing. What needs to be automatic for a multifamily operator? What needs to be second nature? What are things that you do that are just second nature that you just are automatic systems?
All right. Everything that repeats can be automated, can be systemized, can be made more efficient so that it requires less human resource, less brain power, less time and energy. Multifamily operations can be broken down into a set of repeating and recurring tasks. We have cycles in our industry, daily cycles, weekly, monthly, quarterly, and annual cycles where the same things just repeat over and over and over again. I mean, monthly we have rent week, we have rent collection, we have accounts payables, we have to pay bills. Our leasing department has to place ads, we have to conduct showings, we have to intake applications, process the applications, generate a lease, send it out, exchange money, signatures, inspections, onboarding into the online portal system. Move outs, they have to give the keys back. We have to do another walkthrough, another inspection. We have to issue a security deposit letter to comply with state statute. All of this stuff, regular, in and out, day in and day out, it's part of a cycle. It can be automated. Reporting to investors, to banks, all of that stuff happens monthly, quarterly, annually. Get it on a schedule. For us, in multifamily operations, we know what's happening tomorrow, next week, and next month. Here's what you got to do. At the very least, you got to do this if you want to be more efficient in anything. Get your iCal, your Google Calendars, whatever your calendar, your visual system is for organizing your schedule and day. Make a calendar note for everything. So when rent week comes up, the first of the month, calendar, collections. On the third of the month, you're calling people, calendar it. Call people that haven't paid yet. On the 5th, call people that haven't paid yet. On the 7th, call people that haven't paid yet and start legal. I mean, make it a system, stick to what's on the calendar. In our office, we use Google Calendars. Everybody's on it. It's completely transparent. I love it because I can see what everybody's doing. They can see what I'm doing. And I know at any given moment of any given day where anybody is. And we all stick to it. And it works because we all stick to it. A lot of these property management platforms that are out there now, you've got Yardi, Buildium, Appfolio, Realforce, Rent Manager, like all these competing people in the space. All of these products are pretty good at keeping multifamily operators pretty streamlined and pretty efficient. You have to learn how to use their product, but once you do, it makes life pretty easy operating multifamily portfolios.
You mentioned leases being something that's just...
Are we talking about leases again?
We're talking about leases again. I mean, it's done really well for us right now.
People like it.
They do, yeah.
People seem to like it, but I'm going to tell you this. So at the very core of your business in multifamily, in real estate, the very core is your lease document. You got to have good lease documents. And the lease document is so crucial because it defines the landlord-tenant relationship. It says who's responsible for what, because both parties in the relationship have obligations and responsibilities. The lease document needs to spell it all out. At the end of the day, your lease document is a contract for revenue. You're in business, you have a contract for revenue. these are the very contracts that your bank will lend on. Everything revolves around the lease document. Whatever rent you have in your lease document gets populated to a rent roll. Your rent roll then is what gets sent to an appraiser or a bank to value your asset. I mean, it's everything, right? You gotta have strong lease documents. George, 99% of the world uses boilerplate, standard legal form lease documents. And that's okay, but when you just rely on the boilerplate form, you could be leaving a lot of money on the table because that boilerplate form doesn't consider all the myriad of different things that can happen in the landlord-tenant relationship in your building, in your market. My lease in New York City is going to be different from the property owner's lease in Sheboygan, Wisconsin, right? My lease in southern coastal Florida is going to be different than the property owner who's renting properties in the swamps of Mississippi. It's all different. And your market has to help dictate where you're going with your lease language, because in supply-constrained markets where there's just not a whole lot of options and people rent stuff pretty quickly, you can have more in the lease than you could in less competitive markets where you're sitting around hoping for someone to come along and rent your place, and it's crickets until they do. You know, what we were hearing on social media over the past few weeks was that, oh, I would never rent from you if you're pushing that kind of language in your lease document. I just wouldn't rent from you. That's fine. You're free to rent or not rent from whoever you want. That's the beauty of a free marketplace. You don't have to rent from me, and you don't have to rent from anybody you don't want to. But if you want to come into our buildings, you have to come in under our lease document, and we don't negotiate the terms. It's not up for discussion. We send you a lease, you sign it or you don't, no hard feelings if you don't, but it's not negotiable. I can't modify it for you and do something else for that person and do something else for that person over there, and everyone's got a different lease document. No way, man. The last piece that we did talked about not having tenants do work in your building. Guys, I can't stress it enough. Under no circumstances, I'm gonna repeat myself, don't, under any circumstances, ever let a tenant do work in your building. There's so many problems, and it's a hornet's nest of issues. We're going to talk about it right now. So the first thing is, you want your tenants to be tenants, and you want your vendors and suppliers and contractors to be vendors, suppliers, and contractors. If you have someone who's living in your building, and they're like, oh, I'm an electrician, can I just do my own electrical work? I mean, are you kidding me? No. For every tenant, you want them to be a great tenant, you want them to enjoy where they live, you want them to fulfill their payment obligation. If there's a problem, you want them to let you know, and then it's up to you to fix it, and you have to service them. And if they want to renew with you, that's on you. If you've given them good service, then perhaps you'll get them to renew. But again, free marketplace, you're going to get them to renew or not, or sign or not, but it's got to be based on the strength of them as a tenant and the strength of you as an operator. And likewise, when you hire someone to do work in your building, you want to get a certificate of insurance, you want to get standard waivers and releases. God forbid there's an accident. God forbid there's a fire. I mean, can you imagine if you have a tenant who lives in your building do electrical work for you, and you don't get COIs and you don't get the documents right with this person, and they're just doing work as if they were a superintendent or someone like that, and something happens and there's a fire or someone gets hurt? I mean, it's awful. What are you going to tell your insurance company? Well, you're going to tell them that, yeah, you know, this guy in apartment 4 said he was an electrician, so we hired him to. You're going to be considered such an asshole if you do that. Because I'll tell you what, not only do I not like diluting the landlord-tenant relationship by having the resident do work, but you know who else doesn't? Banks and insurance companies. The quickest way to not get a loan is to send a rent roll to your bank where there's all sorts of rent credits for work performed by a tenant that lives in the building. And the quickest way to get denied for an insurance policy application is to have the insurer come by and say, oh, well, send us all your COIs from the people that did work. And you're like, oh yeah, Joey Bag of Donuts in apartment 13 did some plumbing work, and we had that flood, and yeah, we never really figured out why. You're not getting the insurance policy. And then lastly, God forbid someone gets hurt because you acted so stupidly and negligently. Yes, it's negligent. You can be held personally liable. So even if you own the property in an LLC, if you're negligent and someone gets hurt or God forbid dies in a fire or something awful because you hired Joey Bag of Donuts in your apartment who said he was an electrician or a plumber, you got big problems. Don't have residents do work in your building. Now, it's hard for the smaller operators out there because when you're first getting started, you're like, oh, well, I'll just have Jimmy in apartment 1 take out the trash and recycling and we'll give him a rent credit for $50 a week. Please don't be tempted to do this. Keep your landlord-tenant relationships over here. Keep your vendor-supplier relationships over here. Now, if you have someone who happens to live in a building, they want to do some work for you at that property or other properties, and you want to get a certificate of insurance for them and they're properly insured and they sign the right set of documents that every vendor and supplier has to sign so that you can pay them and you get a W-9 from them and process them like a normal vendor as if they didn't live in your building, and at the same time they're fulfilling their tenant obligation and paying rent and communicating with your office completely separate from the work that you're giving them. Okay, but I mean, God, look at how long it just took me to explain that whole scenario. Why do you want to do it? Guys, don't hire tenants or residents of your building to do work for you and give rent credits for it and just hope that it'll all work out. So George, here's a big one, and I don't know that a lot of people do it. So here's the phrase, deemed as additional rent. What does that mean? So in the lease document, you have the rent that the tenant pays to the property owner, but then there's all this other stuff. Late fees, legal fees, repairs and damage charges, utilities charges. All of that stuff, wherever it exists in your lease document, should have the phrase deemed as additional rent appear right after it in every circumstance. Here's why. If you have to go to court for a non-payment case and enforce your rights as the property owner and try to collect non-payment of rent, there's likely going to be non-payment of utility charges, non-payment of late fees. All the other money that they owe you is going to be not paid as well. Well, if you don't have deemed as additional rent after each one of those charges in your lease document, you're going to have to start a separate and distinct small claims case outside of your non-payment of rent case to go and collect all of that other money. It's not connected unless you connect it. So in our lease documents and the documents of a lot of professional operators, but I want to see you smaller operators out there start incorporating this stuff, put in deemed as additional rent after the $50 late fee, because you can't get it unless it says it, and the lease document is what binds the two parties. If it's not in the lease, you can't collect it as additional rent, and you want to be able to collect it as additional rent when you have to take someone to court for non-payment of rent. Otherwise, it's just a whole other separate situation. You have to file an additional complaint, small claims. You have to go, maybe you get it, maybe you don't, maybe the person's moved to Alaska by then, who knows. I promise you, deemed as additional rent, put it in your leases. So George, this is a big one, and I don't know that everyone's doing it. If you're not, you have to put it in your lease. No assignment and no subleasing allowed. Why do you want that? You take all this time to underwrite your applicant, to screen your applicant, to approve them to come into your real estate. You've checked their income, you've checked their background, their criminal history, you've checked their FICO scores. I mean, all the work that you hopefully are doing to screen these tenants, right? It's such a heavy lift. You get them in your real estate, and if they're a couple and someone splits up and a new roommate moves in, or if someone wants to take a new job in West Virginia and they call up their buddy down the street, hey, I'm moving, come take my apartment. You don't know who's moving into your real estate. You want to have control and maintain a sense of control over who's occupying your real estate. And we do that when we screen the applicants and then approve them to become tenants. But at that point, there can't be any assignment or subleasing of that lease document. You give rights to a specific person or people to move into the apartment. Those are the only people that you give those rights to. Anybody else doesn't have rights, and you have to enforce your rights at that point if someone's in there who's unauthorized. So George, here's a Peter Siegel custom. This is a great one, and we spent a lot of time over a lot of years perfecting what this looks like. Here's the deal. In multifamily, how often does the phone ring off the hook? At 7:30 at night, at 5 in the morning, whenever. Hey, management office, my neighbor upstairs is loud. Can you call them and tell them to shut their music down? Or, hey, management office, my neighbor upstairs, the dogs are barking and I can't get my work done and it's a pandemic and I'm working from home and what the fuck, right? So what's happening here is that you've got one resident making their problem your problem. Now, the resident's gonna say, come on, man, you let me into the apartment, I'm paying your rent, you got to give me a peaceful and a quiet environment in which to operate. They're not wrong, but they have to understand that there's very little the property owner or manager can do in most cases. If it's loud noise, if it's a party, I mean, there's other ways in the socio-economic environment in which we live to address that. So if I live in a single-family detached house and I have a problem with a neighbor, I call the cops, I make a noise complaint. Now, I don't want to do that, right? I want to be a good neighbor. I'll go over there first and say, hey man, can you turn it down a little bit? Or, hey, it's 3 a.m. on a Tuesday, we're trying to sleep, can you turn, like whatever the deal is. But in real life, outside of a multi-housing situation where you've got 50 units or 100 units all stacked on top of and next to each other, you got to go next door and deal with it with your neighbors. So we put a peace and quiet clause into our lease document that says, look, you got to go and deal with your neighbor, or you have to call the cops if it's really bad, but make sure it's really bad first. But understand that there's very little that we can do in most cases, and we try and spell out what the cases are. If there's an unauthorized pet and someone in the apartment says, hey, my neighbor next door, their dogs are barking, we know immediately if it's an unauthorized pet or not. Then it's the property owner's situation, it's the property manager's situation to deal with. For the property manager, if the things that are causing the nuisance are those things which are in your lease document, but for us it's no smoking and pets, like we keep a tight control over the pets and we know who has a pet and who doesn't. But if it's those things, the property management office can step in and try and help. George, this is huge, and I bang my head against a brick wall wondering why everybody who's running rental property doesn't do this. Have a clause in your lease that says no drilling or attaching of any hardware to my building so that you can install a flagpole or lighting equipment or satellite dishes in some cases. Now it's property by property basis. I know some single family properties and in some markets you can only get a satellite dish. So I'm not talking about that. In our market, we have satellite dishes, we have Verizon Fios, we have Comcast, we have Optum, we have all that stuff. Nobody can drill into my buildings at all. And what happens is these guys from Comcast come around and they're like, oh yeah, Bob Smith, apartment 2, and they bring out those long drills and they go right through the windows, or they go right through the brick, or they go right through the siding. I mean, how much money have you spent making sure your windows don't leak, making sure your brick is well pointed and doesn't leak, making sure the siding is performing? We've all spent a lot of money and time making sure our buildings are waterproof and weatherproof. Now we have some cable install guy coming and drilling through to give cable. He doesn't care. He's going to drill through whatever the hell he wants to. Put it in your lease, no drilling or attaching of any hardware or drilling any holes or satellite dishes. If the resident only has the option of getting a satellite dish, they should have to call you to work it out as to how that's going to happen. It can't be just their decision unilaterally to go drill your real estate up and put holes in your real estate, because at the end of the day, your property is going to look like Swiss cheese and there's going to be leaks everywhere. No drilling, no attaching of hardware. They got to call the property manager's office for that stuff.
No Swiss cheese real estate. I like it. So I heard this phrase the other day, doing common things uncommonly well.
That's what we do as entrepreneurs.
Right. And, entrepreneurs are not often reinventing the wheel. They're starting businesses and then serving those markets exceptionally well.
Most of them.
Most of them, right. And so, well, if they're successful. There's plenty of unsuccessful entrepreneurs that are not doing that.
Actually, I meant most of them are not reinventing the wheel. Some actually reinvent the wheel.
You have the Musks, you have the Jobs, you have, clearly you do have the exceptions there too. My question for you is, when you were starting out, what did you see multifamily operators doing that wrong, and how did you improve on those
I saw them
models?
do everything wrong. So when I was first starting out, it was sort of pre-technology. It was the dawn of the internet era. And forever, property management and multifamily management is just a completely untechnologically advanced, unsavvy, unsexy business. There's no best practices, there's no cutting edge at all. There was none of that stuff. There was no branding, there was no providing great customer service as if you're a retailer, right? Well, retailers always have to provide great customer service, because if the customer doesn't like what they get, they'll just go next door and get something else. Real estate never was forced to look at customer service, because it was real estate. Like, you live in the apartment, and if you don't like it, you're not really going to move tomorrow. You may move after your lease is up. Chances are you're not. I mean, that was the old mindset. And I saw that everyone was leaving so much opportunity and so much money on the table by not deploying opportunities and tactics from other industries into multifamily. And so when I got into it, I was really quick to deploy whatever technology I could get my hands on. It helped immensely, and nobody else was doing it. And George, when I got started, all of my buildings were very close to one another. And what that allowed me to do was provide great service with consistency and uniformity with the same staff. And I was able to really commit to great service. So it became something that I messaged to my residents, became something that I actually touted about myself. Like, hey, you want to live with us because we give you great service. And people are like, great service? What do you mean? It's an apartment. What do I need service for? Well, we started implementing things that required that we follow up with great service. And people were blown away, and our apartments were always full, and we got top dollar for them because there was a service differential between us and every other old building on the block. And in New York City, all you have is block after block after block of old building, so you're competing with everybody. And the way I competed was by offering great service. No one else was doing it. No one else was building a brand, George. And the brand is the ultimate thing to build and to achieve if you're in business, any kind of business. But in real estate, no one was thinking about building a brand with rental apartment housing. I mean, how do you build a brand with that? So quickly I saw that there was an opportunity to fold all of my units in a neighborhood and in a borough, or ultimately in all of New York City, under one New York City brand. And we had a website with a matching domain name and came up with cute graphics, and we advertised and promoted and messaged ourselves as this brand. And it worked. And it was an early example of a new thing that happened in multifamily that people weren't doing. Now, people are commonly building brands and trying to build brands in the multifamily space. But it wasn't happening before, and I felt like I needed to do it because I didn't want to leave that money or opportunity on the table. You can't do everything well, you can try. I tried, and it worked out okay. And fast forward 30 years, and we're still deploying a lot of those same thought process and mindset into what we do today.
Yeah, and over time, when you do that, you create a community.
Community is important. You know, everything that you do in multifamily is about community because people are living in your product, right? There couldn't be anything more community about being in the multifamily business. You know, if you're selling jeans or t-shirts or sneakers or auto parts, you know, you maybe have to find what community means for you in those examples, because those types of things are commodities at this point in our lives, and you can get them online, you can get them highly sourced anywhere and pretty regularly. But when you live in a building at a particular address, at a particular location, that's your community. The people near you and around you and the places that you go and the things that you do become your community, and it couldn't be more prevalent than in multifamily. And it's a good thing because community really is so much a part of life. It's sort of fun and nice to be in a business where you're offering community in a lot of ways to people. Because when you do that, you've achieved something greater than just the sum of collecting rent and offering apartment housing. You've now created another step towards becoming a brand, and you've solidified your place in the world in your community. So give back to your community. Take pride and ownership of your buildings and your apartments. Take a lot of pride in how you conduct yourselves with people, with your residents, and everybody who you interact with on a daily basis, because it's super meaningful. It's really important. And sure, it's going to translate to the bottom line over time, but you want the world to view you as a good person, as a good business, and that's helpful and great. Be a part of your community and do right by your community.
Hell yeah. All right, Peter. Well, favorite time of week? ZestQuest. This is actually a repeat ZestQuest. We said that we were going to revisit.
A repeat
I know,
ZestQuest.
I know.
Man,
lazy as fuck, right? I know. So
slow news week, George?
It's always a slow news week for me, Peter. When I come back to this question, we had talked about pranks, and I said I'd revisit it, so I'm going to revisit it. You mentioned the last time that you squirted your brother in the jewelry store with some soapy water. You mentioned a prank where you extorted him for quite a bit of money and then paid him back penny by penny. Do you have any other ones that come to mind that you feel like sharing about pranks that either you did or that were inflicted upon you?
When I was a kid, there was the product called the Flowbee, right? It was a hair cutting device that you stuck onto a vacuum as an attachment, and you could cut your hair with this thing that sucked all the hair out and cut your hair at the same time. Wasn't good for me, clearly, but George, for a guy like you, would have been great. But it was a really funny product and a really funny commercial. And my brothers and I all thought it was really funny, and we'd like piss ourselves laughing when the commercial would come on. So one day, I bought Flowbees for my 3 brothers and had them delivered. You know, it was a mail order, and they all got Flowbees in the mail. They're like, what? You know, they didn't know it was me. They figured out quickly that it was me. But what they did was they all held on to them, and then for the years afterwards, what would happen is there'd be this exchange of Flowbees going on in the mail. We'd all get Flowbees. Anytime there's a funny product, like we always think like, well, who would buy that? Like, who's the joker, you know, who's the idiot that would buy that and actually use it? I'm really good at disguising my voice and making prank calls. So one prank call I made was to a peer of my dad's who I thought had a good sense of humor. So I saw that as an opening to sort of display how funny I might be.
How old were you?
I was maybe 14.
Okay.
But I could really shift my voice to not sound like a 14-year-old. So I remember having dinner with a bunch of people, family dinner, friends dinner. This guy was there, my parents were there, and my dad and this guy were having a conversation about business, and he was sharing with my dad how he was all stressed because he was involved in some audit because he moved from New Jersey to Florida, and New Jersey was pissed off, so they were auditing him to make sure that they didn't oversee collecting any money and this whole stuff. So I disguised my voice as a New Jersey tax collector, and I called the guy, and I had him on the phone for like 45 minutes.
Oh my gosh.
And do you remember that scene from Ferris Bueller where the teacher for the principal, Rooney,
Yes.
where she was like, like,
Family member dies, and you insult me. What the hell is the matter with you anyway?
Well, I really don't know, sir. I mean, I didn't think I was talking to you. I thought I was talking to somebody else. You know, sir, that I would never deliberately insult you like that. I can't begin to tell you how embarrassed I am.
Pardon my French, but you're an asshole.
had the guy shitting his pants for like 45 minutes. Finally get off the phone. He's supposed to be like sending all sorts of records and proof of payments and all sorts of stuff into the Division of Revenue. And I called my dad and told him what I did. And my dad was loving it. He was pissing his pants. And so that next day he let the secret out. And my target knew that it was really Marty Siegel's 14-year-old son who had gotten his goat. In college, I lived next to these two girls, and they shared a room, and they were both out of the room, and I snuck in. Their beds were like this. You know, in college, you can have bunk beds or on the floor. They were both on the floor. I snuck in and got underneath. They were already dressed and all that. I wasn't trying to be creepy, but I knew they were going to bed soon. I snuck in, and I hid underneath the bed. I was right underneath the box spring, and I was there, and the roommate saw me. She didn't say anything, and the lights went out. Good night, okay. And then in like 5 minutes, I started like pushing up on them, and I was scaring the shit out of this girl. It was incredible, and I started to increase. I started to really punch at this box spring, and she's like, Debbie, there's someone under my bed. There's like a ghost or something. Debbie, call the police, right? And it was going on for a little while, and finally I went boom, like to the most amount of strength that I had. The girl went flying. She was screaming so loud. Sandy, it was great. I'll never forget that. I haven't thought about that one in a long time, but since George brought it up, I thank you so much for letting me scare the shit out of you that
I'm pretty
night.
sure if that happened to me for the rest of my life, I would check underneath the bed every time I was going to sleep.
She's probably doing that today. I should send her a message and ask her. That was a lot of fun. I mean, look, if you leave an opening, I'm going to be there. Let's just say that.
All right. Well, thanks so much, Peter. I appreciate it.
That's all, George?
Well, I do have one more. So do you want to do one more? I was thinking we were running a little long.
I want to do one more.
All right, cool. So I got one more.
Okay.
If you could have anybody on the podcast to interview, have no resource limitations, no time restrictions, who would you want on? What would you want to talk about?
I'd want to have on my dad, which isn't possible anymore. But I wish he were around to see all of this and the discussions of business and entrepreneurship and mindset and how to conduct yourself and how to achieve and different things to do. I mean, he was the master of that. He could walk into any business and in 42 seconds come up with a laundry list of things, and he'd go around and say, where's the owner, where's the owner, where's the manager, and give the list of suggestions to the owner or manager and say, I'm going to be back next week, I want to see that you guys have done these things because they're really going to help your business. He was great at that stuff, and he was always right about it. Wish I could have him on, and I miss him that I'm not able to have him on, but everything that I've learned about how to do business or make business better or think about business really came from him, and I wish I could share all of that with you guys with him here.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. All right, well, thank you so much, Peter. Appreciate it.
Thanks, George.
I'll see you next week.
Thanks, everybody.